From the window, the world always seems too bright, too busy, too undeniably alive. Down on the street, people are rushing to appointments, mothers are pushing strollers, and the traffic hums with the relentless rhythm of a day that has just begun. But up here, on the 4th floor, I stood behind the glass like a ghost haunting my own life. My name is Amelia, and at 78 years old, I watched that vibrant world with a coldness that froze the window pane, a layer of ice that had formed in my chest not because of the winter outside, but because of the absolute absence of any warmth within. I had reached that dead end, that interior wasteland where silence is not peace, but the empty echo of an imminent surrender. People talk about old age as the golden years, the time of harvest, the sweet rest after a lifetime of labor. What a pious lie that is. For me, it had become the slow, agonizing dismantling of everything I once held sacred, a constant erosion until only the bare rock of a dry, dusty despair remained. I wanted to give up. Yes, I admit it. I don't say this with the dramatic bravado of youth threatening to leave over a trivial heartbreak. I say it with the deep, meditative conviction of someone who has surveyed the rubble of a life and finds no reason to rebuild. I had lost my husband, my Santiago, 5 years ago, and when they lowered his casket into the ground, it felt as though they had buried the colors of the world along with him. With him went the music, the laughter, the smell of damp earth he always brought home from the garden. My children, bless their hearts, have their own lives now. They have their own struggles, their own clocks ticking a frantic rhythm that I can no longer follow, nor do I wish to interfere with. They had left me in this apartment, comfortable, sunny, filled with amenities, but for me, it had transformed into a gilded cage where the bars were the memories that tortured me, and the luxury was nothing more than an imposed, deafening solitude. The faith, that anchor my mother taught me to grip with tooth and nail since the cradle, I had let go of months ago. It didn't leave with a bang. It slipped from my fingers like fine sand, without fanfare, without screams, just with an infinite weariness. How could I believe in a divine plan when the only visible plan was my own slow extinction? The prayers felt hollow, the words bouncing off the ceiling and falling dead at my feet. The churches felt cold, and the image of Christ on the wall seemed like that of a stranger watching me without understanding my earthly agony. I would look at that wooden cross and recriminate him in silence. Where were you, Lord, when my love faded in that hospital bed? Where were you when the house fell silent? Where were you when my own soul screamed for a sign and found only the echo of my own lament? In that silent surrender, in that total abandonment of hope, I had decided that I was done waiting for a rescue that would never come. The morning my final decision was made, it was a Tuesday. I remember the pale sun trying to pierce through the dense fog that had settled over the city and, metaphorically, over my spirit. I had prepared everything with the terrifying meticulousness that only people who have accepted the end can possess. The bills were paid so no one would be burdened. The letters were written, brief and devoid of blame. The few jewels I had left were placed in a velvet box for my granddaughter Elena. I wanted my exit to be clean. I wanted to disappear without causing a ripple in the violent waters of their busy lives. I went to the closet and dressed in my best wool suit, the charcoal gray one that Santiago had gifted me on our silver anniversary. It was a way to go with dignity, a final gesture of self-respect in the face of the void. I buttoned the jacket, my fingers trembling not from fear, but from a strange, vibrating adrenaline. I was ready. I was about to cross the threshold of no return, my hand hovering over the cold brass of the doorknob, ready to step out into the cold finality of the morning. I had convinced myself that this was mercy. I had convinced myself that God, if he existed, had already forgotten my address. But then I heard it. It was a tiny sound, almost imperceptible, breaking the hegemony of my silence. It wasn't a shout, nor was it a cry for help. It was a hum, a melody, a soft, sweet, and terribly out-of-tune humming coming from the landing of the floor below. I froze. My hand, which had been gripping the doorknob with the intent to end it all, released its tension. My heart, which had been beating for months with an irritating lethargy, gave a sudden, sharp jolt. I frowned, feeling a surge of annoyance. Who dared to interrupt this? Who dared to bring life into my pact with darkness? I stepped back from the door, not to open it, but to listen better, drawn by the sheer anomaly of the sound. The song was an old tune, a lullaby that only grandmothers seemed to know, something about a little shepherd and a lost sheep. I hadn't heard that melody in decades, certainly not in this modern, sterilized building where everyone seemed to live with headphones on and a constant rush in their veins. The innocence of the sound was jarring against the grim reality of my intentions. It was like seeing a flower sprouting from a crack in concrete, impossible, yet undeniable. I moved closer to the door, my leather shoes making no sound on the carpet. I pressed my eye to the peephole, feeling a pang of guilt for my curiosity in such a transcendental moment. But the sound was a tether, pulling me back from the ledge. I looked through the distorted glass of the lens, and there he was. Sitting on the highest step of the staircase, his knees pulled up to his chest, wearing a coat that was 2 sizes too big for him. It was Mateo, the boy from 4B, the son of Inez, the young single mother who worked double shifts at the clinic. I knew them only by sight, a polite nod in the elevator, a distant acknowledgement of their existence. Mateo must have been 5 or 6 years old, with messy brown hair and dark eyes that even from this distance seemed to absorb all the light in the hallway. He had a drawing notebook open on his knees and was scribbling furiously with a blue wax crayon, but the humming did not stop. I stayed glued to the peephole, hypnotized. What I saw was not simply a child playing. It was a profound stillness in the middle of chaos, a luminous self-sufficiency that contrasted violently with my own disintegration. He was alone, waiting, with the stoic patience that only children accustomed to waiting develop. But he wasn't sad. He was occupied in his own creative world, in his own bubble of music and blue wax. Then it happened. The boy stopped humming. He lifted his crayon and looked at it intensely, with an expression of deep concentration that seemed too heavy for his small face. Then, as if he had made a monumental decision, he stood up. He turned his body toward my door. I held my breath. He took a tentative step, then another. I wanted to move away, to hide, to pretend I wasn't there, but my feet were rooted to the floor. He reached my door, and in an act that wasn't a knock but a nervous caress, he touched the wood softly. I was paralyzed. My heart was now hammering against my ribs, not out of fear of the child, but out of fear of the intrusion, of the violation of my sanctuary of pain. I felt a furious impulse to yell at him to go away, to leave me in peace with my ending. But the boy didn't wait for an answer. He didn't know I was watching him from the other side of the glass, a woman on the edge of oblivion. He simply crouched down. With a rustle that sounded louder than thunder in the quiet hallway, a folded piece of paper slid underneath my door. It moved across the floorboards, stopping just a few inches from the tips of my polished shoes. Then, silence. Outside, I heard the soft scuff of sneakers against the tile, the resumption of that off-key humming, and the fading sound of the boy returning to his post on the stairs. He hadn't waited for a thank you. He hadn't waited for an acknowledgement. He had simply delivered his message and returned to his own little world. My decision, my farewell, my carefully plotted exit strategy, everything froze. The momentum of my despair was suddenly arrested by an intrusive, childish curiosity. What on earth had he just done? Why me? Why now? My hand, still trembling, fell from the doorknob. I stared at that piece of paper as if it were a bomb or a holy relic. I wasn't sure which. Slowly, painfully, I lowered myself to the floor. My knees cracked, a stark reminder of the 78 years I was so eager to leave behind. But I ignored the physical protest. I reached out a shaking hand and touched the paper. It was a page torn roughly from a spiral notebook, the edges jagged and uneven. It was folded with the imperfect, clumsy precision of small fingers. I unfolded it. It was a drawing done in aggressive strokes of blue and yellow wax crayon. In the center stood a large, round figure. Me, I assumed, though I looked more like a darker blob with a serious face. Beside this figure was a smaller one with wild, scribbled hair and stick legs. But what dominated the page, what occupied the entire upper corner in a violent explosion of yellow wax, was a sun. A gigantic, disproportionate, smiling sun that seemed to vibrate off the paper. But it wasn't the art that stopped my heart in my chest. It was the message scrawled underneath in large, blocky, uneven letters. "You are not alone. The sun always comes back. Mateo." I sat there on the cold marble floor of my entryway, clutching that piece of paper, and I felt the air leave my lungs. That simple sentence, that innocent affirmation from a 5-year-old boy about the mechanics of the celestial bodies and the nature of companionship hit me with the force of a lightning strike. It was an unsolicited, undeserved message that arrived at the exact second of my undoing. The precise word in the silence of disaster. I had asked God where he was. I had screamed internally for a sign, and the universe, which I had sworn had abandoned me, had just used a messenger with scraped knees and a blue crayon to deliver an ultimatum to my surrender. The faith that had vanished without a trace did not return with a celestial choir or a mystical vision. It didn't come with thunder or a burning bush. It returned with the tangible evidence of simple, unadulterated kindness. Mateo didn't know it, but he had just sabotaged my escape. He had forced me to face something I no longer believed was possible, the possibility that not everything was lost. I stayed on the floor for a long time, the cold seeping into my bones, staring at that yellow sun. A burning shame began to rise in my throat. Here I was, Amelia, a woman who had survived wars, the loss of parents, the illness of a husband, and the growing indifference of the world. I had prided myself on my strength, my stoicism, and yet I had been disarmed by a doodle. It was a shame that burned, an emotional slap in the face that snapped me out of the stupor of my self-pity. I stood up clumsily, feeling every year of my age protest, but the physical pain was welcome now. It was a distraction from the emotional abyss I had almost dived into. I walked to the mirror in the hallway. The woman staring back at me wore a charcoal wool suit, chosen for a funeral. Her own. It looked ridiculous now. It looked like a costume for someone trying to play a role of dignity while disintegrating inside. My face was a mask of exhaustion, etched with lines of sorrow, but in my eyes, for the first time in months, there was something other than a vacuum. There was perplexity. There was confusion, and there was a spark of anger. Anger at myself for being so close to wasting the only thing I had left, time. And anger at this child, this Mateo, for forcing me to confront my cowardice with his disarming goodness. I didn't open the door to leave. I turned around and walked to the kitchen. I didn't go there to carry out my original plan. I went to make coffee. The simple, mundane act of filling the kettle, the sound of the water beginning to boil, the bitter, rich aroma of the coffee grounds. These were noises and sensations so grounded in reality that they pulled me back from the edge in a brutal, necessary way. I sat at the dining table, the drawing of the sun next to my cup, and for the first time in a long time, I didn't cry for Santiago. I cried for me. I cried for the woman who had allowed herself to wither until she almost disappeared. That morning, the surrender was postponed, not by a sudden, overwhelming faith in God, but by faith in a drawing. But doubt is a tenacious weed. As the adrenaline faded, the cynicism returned. What if it was just a random act of a bored child? What if it had no divine or profound meaning, just the impulsive need of a kid to share a scribble? I clung to that doubt like a lifeline because it was safer than hope. It was easier to believe it was a coincidence than to accept that my life had been saved by a crayon. The following days were a strange limbo. My routine had been broken, but nothing had replaced it yet. I wandered the apartment, looking at the goodbye letters I had written with a mixture of shame and relief. I tore them up one by one, watching the confetti of my misery fall into the trash. Every time I passed the front door, I stopped. I looked through the peephole. Mateo was there often, sitting on that step, waiting. Sometimes he drew, sometimes he played with a small wooden car, running it along the railing. He never looked at my door. He never tried to contact me again. He simply existed, and his quiet, persistent existence was a silent reproach to my own internal turbulence. I began to observe him like a scientist observing an inexplicable phenomenon. What made this child, so often alone in a hallway, so imperturbable? I, who had lived 3/4 of a century, felt like a student of life before this small master of patience. One afternoon, the elevator doors opened, and I saw his mother, Mrs. Inez. She looked exhausted, her nurse's uniform rumpled, deep dark circles under her eyes, telling a story of double shifts and sleepless nights. She saw me checking my mail and apologized quickly, her voice breathless. "Excuse me if Mateo bothers you, Mrs. Amelia. It's just that he stays alone sometimes when my shift runs long. I'm so sorry." I, the woman who had planned her own end days before, could only manage a clumsy response. "No, he doesn't bother me. He is a quiet child." The conversation was brief, but it peeled back a layer of Mateo's story. His solitude wasn't a choice. It was a necessity of survival for a working mother. And in that solitude, he had found a way to create art and music. And I had chosen solitude and transformed it into an instrument of my own destruction. The psychological tension within me grew. I couldn't go back to my plan of surrender because the drawing of the sun stood in the way, taped mentally to my forehead. But I couldn't embrace life either, because the purpose was still missing. I was trapped in a gray zone, an emotional purgatory where the only catalyst was the soft humming of a child on the landing. Then a memory hit me. Triggered by the sound of his little song drifting through the door, a flashback from my own childhood washed over me. I remembered my grandmother, knitting in her rocking chair with the afternoon sun bathing her hands. She always used to say, "Fear, Amelia, is a thread that weaves shadows, but God's thread is stronger, even if sometimes you only see it in the hand of a child." Back then, terrified of a storm, it comforted me. As an adult, it had seemed cheesy. But now the connection was undeniable. Faith manifests through the simple. God wasn't sending angels with trumpets. He was sending a boy with a blue crayon. I decided to take a small step, an experiment, to test the universe. I went to my kitchen bowl and selected 3 pieces of fruit, a shiny red apple and 2 oranges. I walked to the door, my heart racing as if I were committing a crime. I opened it, placed the small basket of fruit near Mateo's step, and retreated instantly, closing the door and locking it. I felt like a thief. I rushed back to the peephole, holding my breath, waiting to see if the thread would hold. I stood there, pressed against the door, my breath fogging the small glass lens of the peephole. Minutes passed. To me, they felt like hours. My heart was doing that strange flutter again, a mix of anxiety and a desperate, almost pathetic hope. Had I overstepped? Would he be afraid of a random basket of fruit appearing from nowhere? For a long time, Mateo didn't move. He was lost in the blue and yellow world of his notebook, his head bobbing slightly to the rhythm of a tune only he could hear. Then he stopped. He lifted his head, sniffing the air like a small animal detecting a change in the wind. His eyes, those deep, dark pools, shifted from his paper to the floor beside him. He saw the basket. He didn't jump. He didn't look around with suspicion. He didn't scramble up to bang on my door to ask who left it. He simply stared at the red apple and the bright orange skin of the citrus for a long moment. Then, he lifted his gaze toward my closed door. Through the fisheye distortion of the lens, his face looked small and distant, but his expression was clear. It wasn't fear, it was acknowledgement. He didn't wave, he didn't speak. He just reached out a small hand, picked up one of the oranges, and began to peel it. He struggled with the thick rind, his small fingers working diligently, and then he popped a segment into his mouth. He went back to his drawing, chewing slowly. The knot in my throat tightened until it hurt. He hadn't asked where the kindness came from, he had simply accepted it. There was something so profoundly trusting in that action. In a world that teaches us to fear strangers, to question motives, to build walls, this child just accepted the fruit. His acceptance was more powerful than any verbal thank you could have been. It broke me down a little more, chipping away at the cynicism I had built around my heart like a fortress. The next day, I did it again. A small box of apple juice and a packet of butter cookies. I performed the same ritual, the stealthy opening of the door, the quick placement, the retreat to the peephole. This time, when I returned to my hiding spot, I noticed something that made my breath catch. The drawing, the original one with the sun and the promise, was no longer on my side table where I had tossed it. I had moved it to the dining room table. I had smoothed out the creases. Without realizing it, I had framed it in my mind. The solitude, my great companion and executioner, was cracking. The silent routine of my despair was being replaced by the anticipation of these furtive interactions. The narrative rhythm of my life had shifted from a melancholy pause to the tension of waiting. Was this God? Or was this just the intrinsic human need to connect, to give, even if it was just an apple to an unknown child? It was a revelation that made me tremble, a human and vulnerable truth clawing its way through the ashes of my lost faith. I was starting to live not for myself, but for the expectation of the boy on the landing. And that expectation, however small, was the first real heartbeat I had felt in a long, long time. But watching from the shadows wasn't enough. I needed to know more. I needed to understand why this child was different. I needed this miracle of crayon and silence to become coherent, or I feared my surrender would return with a vengeance. The need for a direct interaction became an urgency. I couldn't keep being the ghost behind door 4C. That dynamic, although it had stopped my suicide, was unsustainable. It felt cowardly. I was Amelia, a woman who had managed household budgets, raised strong children, and faced doctors with steel serenity during Santiago's illness. I couldn't let my life depend on observation through a peephole. My loneliness had broken, but the structure of my faith remained fragile. It needed cement. It needed a palpable confirmation that what was happening was an intervention, a sign, and not just a coincidence of proximity. One Tuesday, exactly a week after the first drawing, I waited. Instead of leaving the basket and hiding, I armed myself with courage. I opened the door to my apartment, just a crack at first, and stood on the threshold. My hand trembled slightly on the cold metal of the doorknob. In my other hand, I held a coloring book and a set of expensive colored pencils, a gift I had bought months ago for a granddaughter I rarely saw and had never mailed. Mateo was on his usual step, focused on a small wooden car he was running along the edge of the stair railing. The air felt charged. It was my first conscious movement toward the outside world in months. The silence was so dense I felt the beat of my heart echoing in the hallway. Finally, I gathered the courage and spoke. My voice, raspy from disuse, sounded lower than I expected. "Mateo," I said, almost a whisper. He stopped the car. He lifted his head. He didn't startle, which surprised me. His look was direct, those dark eyes devoid of the cynicism or mistrust one expects in children raised in the city. It was just a clean, open curiosity. I felt completely exposed, stripped of my defenses. "Good morning," he replied, his voice surprisingly clear and polite. "Good morning, Mateo. I am Amelia, your neighbor from upstairs." I gestured awkwardly with the colored pencils. "I saw that you like to draw. I wanted to give you these, so you can keep making your works of art." He stood up, a movement slow and meditative. He approached me, not with the grabby haste of a child offered a gift, but with the dignity of someone weighing an offer. He took the pencils and the book with both hands. His touch was so brief and light I barely felt it, yet it seemed to burn my skin. "Thank you, Mrs. Amelia," he said. Then he looked at me fixedly, with a depth unusual for his age. He tilted his head slightly, sniffing the air again. "Are you better today? The house doesn't smell so sad anymore." I froze. The blood drained from my face. That sentence, "the house doesn't smell so sad anymore," hit me with the force of a physical blow. A child had smelled my despair. He had perceived the emotional essence of my surrender through the cracks in the door. It was a revelation of such intimate vulnerability that I felt like he had read my diary. "Sad?" I managed to mumble, feeling my eyes welling up with tears I couldn't stop. "Yes," Mateo explained with total seriousness, looking past me into the dim hallway of my apartment. "It used to smell like an old key, cold metal, closed doors." He looked back at me, a small smile playing on his lips. "But today, it smells a little bit like cinnamon. That is better." Cinnamon. I had put a pinch of cinnamon in my coffee that morning, a tiny, unconscious detail, a vestige of an old habit I used to share with Santiago. And Mateo had caught it. He hadn't just perceived the sadness, he had detected the change, the minuscule turn of the screw toward life. In that moment, the doubt vanished. This was not a coincidence. This child was a lighthouse, an instrument, a catalyst. I had been looking for faith in grand miracles, in celestial apparitions, and God was sending it to me in the olfactory perceptions of a 5-year-old boy. This was the first of our conversations. They weren't long, deep philosophical exchanges, but bursts of childish wisdom that shattered my defenses. I discovered that Mateo waited for his mother often, that he loved drawing the sun because it's the easiest thing to promise, and that the lullaby he hummed was one he learned from his great-grandmother. As he spoke, a coherent and powerful flashback washed over me. I remembered a phrase Santiago had said years ago when we were navigating a financial crisis that threatened to take our home. He had held my hand and said, "Amelia, people only look for the big waves, but salvation comes in the small tides that bring you closer to the shore." I had been looking for the giant wave of comfort to wash away my grief, and the universe had sent me the tide of Mateo. The emotional dynamic changed instantly. The despair transformed into an intense curiosity and slowly into a fierce, protective affection. My mission was no longer to surrender or to die. It was to protect this small source of light on the landing. I started baking. It was something I hadn't done since Santiago died. The kitchen, once a mausoleum of cold surfaces, became a laboratory of scents. I made oatmeal cookies, rich with the smell of cinnamon and walnuts, and I would bring them out to Mateo. He accepted them with a smile that wasn't forced politeness, but pure, simple pleasure. "These are the promise cookies," I told him one day, the words slipping out before I could check them. He chewed thoughtfully and nodded. "The promise of what?" he asked, crumbs on his chin. "The promise that the sun always comes back," I replied, using his own words. In that interaction, I didn't just feed his stomach, I fed my own starving soul. But as the days turned into weeks, the narrative tension grew. I was building my life around him, a temporary creature in my path. What would happen when he left? What would happen if my fragile faith, now entirely based on this boy, collapsed without his presence? This question caused me nights of insomnia. It was a new internal doubt, a replacement for my desire to die, the fear of losing my new faith. I needed to know if this foundation was real. One afternoon, I dared to ask him something more personal, something that touched the core of my own struggle. "Mateo," I said, sitting on the step below him, my joints aching but my heart full. "Why did you draw the sun so big in that picture you gave me? It took up almost the whole page." He looked at me, the colored pencils I had given him scattered around his sneakers. He took his time to answer, with that reflective pause that fascinated me. "Because it's the biggest part of the promise," he said, picking up a yellow pencil. "It's the thing that never leaves. It's there, even if you don't see it because of the clouds. My mom says it's like God. You don't always see him, but if you draw him big, you forget less." I sat there stunned. He had, unconsciously, articulated the theology that I, a woman of lifelong faith, had forgotten in my grief. The permanence of light, even when hidden. Faith isn't seeing. It's remembering the promise and drawing it big so you don't forget. God hadn't used me to save the boy. God had used the boy to remind me that my faith wasn't a feeling, but a promise that had to be drawn, made tangible. My vision widened. Surrender was no longer an option, because to surrender was to deny the sun, the promise, the cinnamon, and the unexpected goodness. There was a reason, a structure, a purpose revealing itself through the smallest, most innocent things. My heart was healing, not overnight, but cookie by cookie, promise by promise, crayon by crayon. The discovery that faith is a promise that must be actively drawn, a lesson taught to me by a 5-year-old boy with a penchant for yellow wax crayons, propelled me into a period of intense action and reflection. I was no longer just the self-appointed guardian of my own front door. I had become an apprentice of the light. But life, even when pierced by a sudden, brilliant ray of hope, is complex and woven with persistent, stubborn shadows. My past, my crushing grief for Santiago, and the silence of my home were still ghosts that inhabited the corners of my apartment. The new relationship with Mateo didn't exorcise them completely. It only silenced them temporarily, pushing them into the shadows when the sun was high. But when the evening came, when the hallway went quiet, and Mateo went inside to his mother. The ghosts returned. I realized that I needed an anchor deeper than a child, as miraculous as he was. I needed this miracle to be integrated into my own fractured history of faith and pain. My mind began to work overtime, peeling back the layers of my memories, searching for coherence in the chaos of the last 5 years. In the quiet hours of the night, I came to a brutal realization. My surrender, that day I stood in the wool suit ready to leave, hadn't just been about sadness. It had been about guilt. It was the irrational, suffocating guilt that survivors feel, the guilt of still drawing breath when your other half has ceased to do so. I was haunted by the memory of having to let go of Santiago's hand in his final moments. I remembered the antiseptic chill of the hospital room, the rhythmic beeping of the monitor slowing down into a final, flatlining silence, and the screaming voice inside my head that had plagued me ever since. I didn't do enough. I didn't pray enough. I didn't ask with enough strength. This was the true knot that Mateo had unknowingly begun to untie. It wasn't just that I missed Santiago. It was that I blamed myself for his absence. I believed, in the darkest recess of my heart, that my faith had been insufficient to save him. I felt that God had looked at my prayers and found them wanting. This toxic theology had poisoned my soul, convincing me that I was unworthy of the life left to me. One afternoon, the air in the hallway was thick and humid, the kind of heavy atmosphere that precedes a summer storm. Mateo was sitting on his step, but today the vibe was different. He wasn't humming. He was frowning, his tongue poking out slightly from the corner of his mouth in deep concentration. He was coloring in a coloring book, attacking the page with a purple crayon. I sat down on the step below him, feeling the cold stones seep into my skirt, a sensation that now felt grounding rather than chilling. I looked at his artwork. It was a dragon, but not a scary dragon. It was a dragon he was coloring in impossible, vibrant shades of purple and neon green. "That is a very energetic dragon," I commented softly. Mateo didn't look up. He pressed harder, the wax nearly snapping. "It's a heavy dragon," he muttered. "Heavy?" I asked. "Yes. He has to carry the castle. It's too heavy for him, but he thinks he has to do it." The metaphor hung in the air between us, heavy and pregnant with meaning. I watched his small hand gripping the crayon, his knuckles white. He looked frustrated, a rare emotion for him. It was the perfect opening, a window into the vulnerability we both shared. I decided to voice the question that had been gnawing at me, projecting my own adult agony onto his childhood canvas to see what reflected back. "Mateo," I said, my voice trembling slightly, "do you ever feel like you did something wrong? Even if you didn't actually do it? Like you're guilty of something you couldn't control?" The boy stopped coloring. He slowly lowered the purple crayon. He turned his head and looked at me, his dark eyes searching my face. For a moment, I thought he wouldn't understand. I thought the question was too abstract, too adult for a kindergartner. But I had underestimated him again. "You mean like when the milk spills?" he asked. "Maybe," I said, encouraging him. "Or bigger things." "Yes," he said, his voice small. Sometimes when my mom comes home and she is sad, her eyes are red and she doesn't talk, I feel like I did it. I feel like if I had been a better boy, or if I had cleaned my room better, she wouldn't be sad. I feel like it's my fault the happy went away." My heart broke for him, but at the same time it resonated with a frequency that shook my bones. He felt responsible for his mother's exhaustion, just as I felt responsible for Santiago's death. It was the universal burden of love, thinking that if we just love hard enough, we can control the universe. "And what do you do?" I whispered, leaning in. "When you feel like that?" Mateo looked back at his dragon. He picked up the green crayon and started coloring the dragon's wings. His answer was the narrative twist that reshaped my entire understanding of my grief. "I talked to my grandma about it on the phone," he said, matter-of-factly. "She told me that I am not the weather. She said, 'Mateo, you are the gardener, but you are not the rain. If the rain comes or if the sun goes away, it's not because I was bad. It's just the weather. I can't control the sky. I can only take care of the flowers.'" I sat back, stunned into silence. "You are the gardener, but you are not the rain." The simplicity of it shattered the complex fortress of guilt I had built over 5 years. I had been blaming myself for the storm. I had been blaming myself for the winter that took Santiago, thinking that if I had just been a better gardener, I could have stopped the seasons from changing. I had taken the role of God upon myself, assuming responsibility for life and death, and then punishing myself when I failed to uphold that impossible standard. Mateo continued, oblivious to the theological earthquake he had just triggered in my soul. So now, when Mom is sad, I don't try to fix the sky. I just make her a drawing, or I sit with her. That's gardening. The dragon is heavy because he's trying to carry the castle. He pointed to his picture. But dragons are supposed to fly, not carry buildings. He looked at me, his eyes wide and innocent. Mrs. Amelia, are you trying to carry a castle? Tears pricked my eyes, hot and fast. I nodded, unable to speak. Yes, Mateo. I think I have been carrying a very big castle for a very long time. You should put it down, he said, returning to his work with a shrug. It makes your colors look tired. That night, I went back to my apartment, but I didn't go to bed. I went to the box where I kept Santiago's things, the castle I had been carrying. I looked at his watch, his glasses, his Bible. For 5 years, these objects had been artifacts of my failure. But now, viewed through the lens of Mateo's wisdom, they looked different. They were just things. They were evidence of a season I had lived, not a trial I had failed. I wasn't the rain. I wasn't the master of life and death. I was just the gardener who had loved him as best she could while he was here. I picked up his Bible. It fell open to a passage in Ecclesiastes about there being a time for everything, a time to weep and a time to laugh. I realized I had been trying to freeze time, to stop the weeping through sheer force of will, and when I couldn't, I blamed my faith. But faith wasn't about stopping the rain. It was about trusting the gardener who actually controlled it. I felt a physical weight lift from my shoulders, a release so profound it made me dizzy. The guilt, that dark, oily substance that had coated my memories, began to dissolve. I wasn't guilty. I was just human. I had been a witness to his death, not the cause of it. I went to the window and looked out at the city lights. The world was still busy, still bright, but it no longer looked hostile. It looked like a garden, a messy, chaotic, uncontrollable garden. And for the first time, I felt a desire not to leave it, but to plant something in it. I am not the weather, I whispered to the glass. I am just the gardener. But just as I began to feel this new, fragile peace taking root, just as I began to believe that the worst was behind me, the universe decided to test this new theory. The next day, when I went to the peephole at our usual time, the landing was empty. There was no humming, no wooden car, no blue crayon. I waited for an hour. Then, too, silence. The door to 4B remained shut. A cold dread, different from the old despair but just as sharp, began to creep up my spine. Where was the boy? Where was the sun? The silence that followed was not the peaceful quiet of a library, nor was it the heavy, suffocating silence of my own depression that I had lived with for years. This was a sharp, jagged silence. It was a vacuum, a hole in the universe where a boy's humming and the scratch of crayons should have been. For the first 24 hours, I rationalized it. I told myself that perhaps they had gone to visit relatives, or maybe the weather was simply too nice to sit in a hallway. But deep down, my stomach churned with an acidic anxiety. The ecosystem of my recovery depended on that child. Without the daily confirmation of his existence, without the visual proof of the sun, my old demons began to scratch at the door, whispering that happiness was just a fluke, a temporary glitch in the system of misery. By the second day, the anxiety had morphed into a physical compulsion. I couldn't sit still. I paced my living room, my shoes clicking a frantic rhythm on the hardwood floors. I checked the peephole every 10 minutes, feeling more and more like a desperate sentinel guarding an empty fortress. The hallway remained stubbornly empty. No wooden cars, no drawings, no Mateo. The absence felt personal, as if the light had been turned off specifically to test my night vision. On the morning of the third day, the rationalizations crumbled. I woke up with a sense of dread that settled heavy in my chest. I remembered the gardener metaphor. A gardener doesn't just sit on the porch and hope the flowers survive a drought. A gardener carries the water. If the boy wasn't in the hallway, then the hallway was no longer where I was needed. I had to cross the threshold. I had to go to the source. I baked. It was my shield, my excuse. I made a batch of banana bread, the loaf heavy and warm in my hands, wrapping it in a linen towel. It was a ticket of entry, a way to mask my intrusion as neighborly kindness. I walked out of my apartment, and for the first time, I didn't stop at the landing. I walked down the 12 steps that separated my floor from his. The distance felt immense, a canyon I was crossing without a map. I stood in front of door 4B. The wood was chipped, the paint peeling slightly in the corners, details I had never noticed from my perch above. I raised my hand. My knuckles hovered over the wood. What if I'm unwanted? What if this is an intrusion? The old fear of rejection flared up, but then I thought of the heavy dragon carrying the castle. I wasn't going to be the dragon anymore. I knocked. 3 sharp raps. The weight was agonizing. I heard shuffling inside, the heavy slide of a deadbolt, and then the door cracked open. It was Inez. But it wasn't the composed, tired nurse I had met briefly at the mailboxes. She looked wrecked. Her hair was pulled back in a messy, loose bun, strands falling over her face. Her eyes were red-rimmed and swollen, dark circles carved deep into her skin like bruises. She was wearing an oversized t-shirt and sweatpants, and the smell wafting from the apartment wasn't cinnamon. It was the stale, medicinal scent of sickness and worry. "Mrs. Amelia?" she asked, her voice cracking, confused. She blinked, struggling to focus on me. I haven't seen Mateo," I stammered, clutching the banana bread like a lifeline. "I brought this. Is everything all right?" Inez looked at the bread, then back at me, and her face crumpled. The facade of the strong single mother holding it all together shattered right there in the doorway. She pressed a hand to her mouth to stifle a sob. "It's Mateo," she whispered, stepping back to let me in, an invitation born of sheer exhaustion. He's really sick. The fever won't go down. It's been 3 days." I stepped into the apartment. It was small, cramped, and cluttered, but vibrant. Drawings, hundreds of them, were taped to the walls, covering the peeling wallpaper with a kaleidoscope of suns, dragons, and flowers. It was a museum of hope, but the air was heavy. In the corner of the living room, on a small sofa converted into a bed, lay Mateo. My heart stopped. He looked so small. The boy who carried the energy of a star, who commanded the hallway with his presence, was reduced to a lump under a heavy wool blanket. His face was flushed a dangerous shade of crimson, his skin glistening with sweat. His breathing was shallow and raspy, a terrible wet sound that filled the small room. The blue crayons were nowhere to be seen. The sun was eclipsed. "I called in sick for 2 days, Inez said, her voice trembling as she closed the door behind us. "But they called me an hour ago. If I don't go in for the night shift tonight, I lose the job. I don't have any more leave, but I can't leave him like this. I don't know what to do. I'm alone, Amelia. I'm so alone." The confession hung in the air, raw and desperate. She was the heavy dragon trying to carry the castle of survival while her world burned down. And in that moment, looking at this terrified mother and this fragile child, the last remnants of my own self-pity evaporated. They didn't just leave. They were incinerated by the heat of a sudden, fierce purpose. I realized why I was still here. I realized why Santiago had gone and I had stayed. I wasn't left behind to wither. I was left behind because I had a shift to cover. I walked over to the table and set the banana bread down with a definitive thud. I turned to Inez, and I felt a spine of steel straighten within me. The same steel that had held me up during Santiago's treatments. The same steel that had raised my own children. "You are going to work," I said. My voice surprised me. It wasn't the wavering voice of an old widow, it was the command of a matriarch. Inez looked at me, stunned. "What? No, I can't." "You are going to work," I repeated, gentler this time, but with zero room for argument. "You need this job. Mateo needs you to have this job." And I took a step toward her and placed my hands on her trembling shoulders. "I have absolutely nothing else to do. I have nowhere to be. I have no one waiting for me. I will stay with him. But, Mrs. Amelia, I can't ask you that. He's sick, he's fussy, It's all night. You are not asking, I corrected her. I am offering. I am the gardener today, Inez. Let me watch the flower. You go fight the rain. She looked at me for a long, breathless moment, searching for hesitation in my eyes. She found none. Then she collapsed into me, hugging me with a force that nearly knocked the wind out of me. She cried on my shoulder, huge, heaving sobs of relief, and I held her, feeling the warmth of human connection flooding into the cold spaces of my heart. 10 minutes later, Inez was rushing out the door, her uniform on, a list of instructions and medications pressed into my hand. The door clicked shut, and for the first time, I was alone inside the world of 4B. I turned to the sofa. Mateo shifted, moaning softly in his sleep. I pulled a chair up to his bedside, the same way I had done for Santiago 1,000 times. But this time, it wasn't a vigil for the end. It was a vigil for the beginning. I soaked a washcloth in cool water from the kitchen bowl. I sat down and gently wiped his burning forehead. His eyes fluttered open. They were glassy, unfocused, swimming in the haze of fever. He looked at me, confused, trying to place the gray-haired woman in his living room. "Amelia?" he croaked, his voice a tiny, scratchy whisper. "Shh, I'm here, Mateo," I soothed, brushing the wet hair from his brow. "Mom had to work. I'm here to make sure the dragon doesn't get too heavy." He blinked slowly, the recognition settling in. He looked terrified, not of me, but of the sickness, of the vulnerability. "It's dark," he whispered, closing his eyes again. "I can't find the sun. I tried to draw it in my head, but it keeps going away." "That's okay," I whispered, leaning close to his ear. "You don't have to draw it today. I'll hold the picture for you. You just rest." Hours passed. The night deepened. The fever spiked, as fevers always do in the witching hours. He tossed and turned, mumbling about castles and rain. I didn't sleep. I measured doses of syrup. I changed cool compresses. I hummed. Me, the woman who had forgotten how to sing. I hummed his lullaby. It was rusty and off-key, but it seemed to settle him. Around 3 a.m., the crisis hit. He woke up crying, shivering violently, his teeth chattering. "It's too cold, it's too cold," he sobbed, though his skin was burning. Panic, cold and sharp, tried to rise in my throat. What if I can't do this? What if he gets worse? I'm too old for this. The doubts attacked me, trying to paralyze my hands. But then, I looked at the wall above his head. There, taped crookedly with Scotch tape, was the first drawing he had given me. The yellow sun, the promise. "You are not alone." I recited the words he had written for me. I climbed onto the narrow sofa next to him. I pulled him into my arms, wrapping my own body around his small, shivering frame, creating a cocoon of warmth and safety. I held him tight, rocking him gently. "I've got you, Mateo. I've got you. The sun is coming back. I promise. I'm watching for it." I held him through the shaking. I held him until my arms ached and my back stiffened. I fought the fever with my own body heat and my own stubborn will. I wasn't Amelia the widow. I wasn't Amelia the suicidal woman from 4C. I was the vessel of the promise. And as I held him, I felt the fever break. It happened just before dawn. The shivering stopped. His breathing deepened and slowed into a rhythmic, peaceful swoosh. His skin cooled against mine. I didn't move. I watched the window. I watched the sky turn from black to bruised purple, then to a soft, washing gray. And then, finally, a single, piercing beam of gold cut through the clouds and hit the floor of the dusty apartment. The sun. It had come back. And this time, I hadn't just watched it through a window. I had helped usher it in. I looked down at the sleeping boy, and I knew the script of my life had been rewritten. The ending I had planned was gone. A new chapter had just begun, written in fever, banana bread, and the absolute certainty of love. I was tired, my bones ached, but I had never felt so alive. I held him until the morning light was undeniable, until the last shadow had been chased out of the room. When Mateo's small body was completely cool and his breathing was soft and deep against my chest, I knew the crisis had passed. The physical exhaustion that washed over me was bone deep. a heavy, wonderful fatigue that felt earned. My arms ached, my joints screamed their protests, but I had never felt this kind of strength before. It was the strength of purpose, the visceral power of a life that had finally found its assignment. I had held the sun until it came back. Just as the city outside began to stir, I heard the faint click of the lock. Inez was home. She walked into the apartment, her nurse's uniform rumpled from a long, anxious night, but her eyes were already wide with fear. She saw me sitting on the sofa, holding Mateo, and for a split second, I saw terror flash across her face. Then, she registered the peace in the room, the calmness of the boy's breathing, the way his hand was curled loosely against my heart. She didn't rush. She walked slowly, quietly, until she reached the side of the sofa, and then she simply sank to her knees. She didn't say thank you. She didn't need to. She just rested her forehead on the blanket beside Mateo's feet and wept, not sobs of despair, but silent, convulsive tears of pure, shattering relief. I reached out a hand and placed it gently on her head, offering the comfort of a woman who understands that true strength often means allowing yourself to be weak in the presence of someone you trust. The fever broke just before dawn, I told her softly. He's fine, Inez. He just needed to know someone was holding the promise. She finally looked up, her eyes shining with unshed tears and a gratitude that transcended words. In that moment, the barriers of floor 4C and 4B dissolved. The distinction between neighbor and family was permanently erased. She didn't owe me a job. She owed me her son, and in doing so, she had given me my life back. I don't know how to repay you, Amelia, she whispered, her voice rough. You already have, I replied, pressing a kiss to the top of Mateo's head. You taught me that I am the gardener, not the rain. You just gave me a reason to keep tending the garden. That morning marked the true end of the old Amelia. The woman who wore the wool suit and prepared her own departure vanished completely. When I returned to my apartment, I didn't rest. I went straight to the closet. I pulled out the charcoal wool suit and all the gray, somber clothes that reflected my internal winter. I donated them. I threw out the empty silence that had consumed my apartment. I began to move things. Santiago's reading chair, unused for 5 years, was pulled back into the sunlight. I took the drawing of the sun, removed the tape, and had it professionally framed. I hung it in my kitchen, a daily brilliant reminder that the light is permanent. The scent of cinnamon, once a novelty, became the constant aroma of my home, a tangible representation of the warmth that had returned. I stopped being an invisible spectator. I became a fixture. I continued to babysit Mateo, not just when he was sick, but whenever Inez had long shifts. I taught Mateo to bake my grandmother's cookies. He, in turn, taught me to see the world not through the lens of loss, but through the limitless perspective of a child. The grand realization, the theology of resilience that I want to leave with you, is this. I had been so focused on giving up because I believed that failure to control death meant failure of faith. I had sought a complex adult miracle, but grace, true redemption, works through simplicity. God didn't send a grand sign. He used a child's intuition and pure heart to save me from myself. I wanted to give up, and the truth is, I almost succeeded. But the moment I was ready to surrender my existence, the universe sent me a small, persistent reminder that I was not alone. The sun, the promise of renewal, was waiting right outside my door. It wasn't waiting for me to be perfect. It was waiting for me to be present. The story of our lives is not written in the major tragedies, but in the small, daily acts of kindness that tie us to one another, thread by fragile, resilient thread. Mateo taught me that the biggest lie we tell ourselves is that we have to carry the whole castle. We don't. Our task is much simpler, much gentler. Our task is to show up, to share the cookies, to hold the hand of someone shivering in the dark, and to keep drawing the sun, no matter how cloudy the sky gets. I never found the perfect answer for why Santiago had to leave. I never got the grand, celestial explanation for my pain. But I received something infinitely more valuable than an answer. I received purpose. I learned that my faith wasn't restored by an event, but by a relationship. It wasn't about believing in a distant God. It was about seeing God's hands in the scraped knees of a child and hearing his voice in an out-of-tune lullaby. My hallway is never silent now. Sometimes, the humming of a shepherd boy drifts up to my floor. Sometimes, the scent of fresh-baked cookies drifts down to his. On any given afternoon, you might find me, Amelia, sitting on the staircase, not dressed in funereal gray, but in a bright cardigan, my joints aching a little, but my spirit soaring. I'll be sitting next to a little boy, teaching him how to shade a dragon's wing. My life, once a closed door, is now a shared space. And every time I look at that framed drawing of the big yellow sun, I remember the precise moment when despair met promise. I remember the incredible truth that sometimes God used a child to restore my faith. He didn't use strength, he used vulnerability. He didn't use an adult's theology, he used a child's crayon. And I will spend the rest of my years being eternally grateful for that little gardener who taught an old woman how to water her own soul. I am not the rain. I am the gardener, and the sun always comes back.